Ethan Cole was not a hero, he was just a tired man driving home. He had worked 14 hours straight that day. 2 car accidents, a heart attack, an old woman who fell down her stairs and broke 3 ribs. He had seen blood, he had seen fear, he had seen people grab his arm and beg him not to let go. He never let go. That was just who he was. The road was empty. That night the sky was dark and full of stars. The cornfields on both sides of the highway stood still like sleeping soldiers. His truck hummed quietly. He was thinking about nothing. He was thinking about his bed. He was thinking about how good it would feel to finally close his eyes. Then he saw the light. It was not a normal light. It was not a car. It was not a house in the distance. It was something burning, something that had fallen from the sky and landed in the cornfield to his right. The stalks were crushed and blackened, a trail of broken earth cut through the field like something heavy had skidded across it. The smell reached him through the window, something sharp, something strange, like metal and rain and something else he had no name for. Ethan slowed down. He told himself to keep driving. He was exhausted. He was not on duty anymore. Whatever had fallen could be a plane crash, could be a drone, could be a gas tank explosion. The right thing was to call it in and let someone else handle it. Stopped the truck. He sat there for 10 seconds. Then he grabbed his emergency kit from the back seat and got out. The field was quiet. The burning wreckage was about 80 meters and he could see it clearly now. It was not a plane. It was not anything he had ever seen before. It was shaped like something between a ship and a shell, made of dark metal with strange patterns carved into its surface that seemed to glow faintly even through the smoke. The front was completely destroyed, like it had hit the ground at enormous speed, but the back half was still mostly whole. Ethan moved toward it slowly. He was not thinking about aliens. He was not thinking about government conspiracies or movies he had seen. He was thinking about whether someone was alive inside. He heard something, a sound low, weak, like breathing that was working too hard. He moved around the broken edge of the wreckage and found her. She was lying on the ground a few feet from the ship. She had clearly been thrown out or had crawled out. He could not tell which. She was tall, taller than any person he had ever seen. Her skin was silver, not gray, not pale silver like the inside of a mirror, but it was damaged in several places. It was dark and burned and cracked, and something clear and faintly glowing was leaking out of those cracks like it was her blood. Her hair was white and lay scattered around her head in the dirt. Her eyes, when they opened for just a moment, were completely gold. No pupil, no white, just gold, like 2 coins pressed into her face. She looked at him. She did not scream. She did not move. She just looked at him with those gold eyes, and he could see something in them that he recognized, even though everything else about her was completely foreign. She was afraid not of dying. She had already accepted dying. He could tell that he had seen that look on patients before. That quiet surrender when the body has given up and the mind is just waiting. She was afraid of him. Ethan crouched down. He put his kit on the ground. He opened it slowly, keeping his movements small and calm. He had done this before, not with aliens. Obviously not with anything like this, but he had talked to car crash victims who were in shock. He had treated people who were terrified of hospitals, terrified of needles, terrified of strangers touching them. The approach was always the same: slow, calm, no sudden moves, speak softly, even if they cannot understand you. He said quietly that he was not going to hurt her. He said he was going to help. He said she did not need to be scared. She did not understand his words. He could see that, but she watched his hands. She watched him take out gauze and a small light to check her injuries. She watched him lean forward carefully and examine the wounds on her side. Her body stiffened for a moment when his hand came close, and then slowly. It did not. The wounds were bad. He had no idea how her body worked. He had no idea if what he was doing would help or make things worse, but he knew bleeding. He knew that pressure helped. He knew that leaving an open wound exposed to the dirt and the air was worse than doing something. He worked carefully. He pressed clean gauze to the largest wound. He watched to see if the glowing liquid slowed down. It did. He worked for 20 minutes. She did not fight him. She watched him the whole time with those gold eyes, and he felt the weight of that gaze like something pressing gently against his chest. She was studying him. He could feel it like she was trying to understand something that did not make sense to her. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and looked at her. She was still too hurt to move. He could not leave her in the field. She would not survive the night. He looked at the sky. He looked at the road. He looked at his truck. He made a decision. He lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected. He carried her across the field back to his truck. He laid her gently across the back seat. He got in and started driving, not to a hospital, not to a police station, not to anywhere official. He drove home. He did not fully understand why. He just knew that showing up at an emergency room with a silver woman who bled glowing liquid would not end well for her. He had seen enough of how the world worked to know that she would become a thing to be studied. She would become a problem to be contained. She would stop being a person, and whatever she was, wherever she came from, she was a person. He was sure of that. The whole drive home she drifted in and out of consciousness. Once she opened her eyes and looked at him in the mirror and said something in a language that was soft and strange, like wind moving through something hollow. He did not understand it. The next morning, after she was resting in his spare room and he had done everything he could think of to keep her stable, he went back to the field. He found the wreckage. He found a small device half buried in the dirt. It was undamaged. It had a small screen on it. He pressed it by accident and words appeared. Not in English, but after a moment the device flickered and shifted and translated itself. He scrolled back through it until he found what she had said in the truck. He read it once. He sat down in the dirt in the middle of the burned cornfield with the morning sun coming up around him, and he read it again. It said, "Why are you not afraid of me?" Ethan sat there for a long time. He did not have a good answer. He just knew that fear had never once crossed his mind. She did not speak for 3 days. She lay in Ethan's spare room with the curtains drawn and the window cracked open, and she watched everything with those gold eyes like a person reading a book in a language they were slowly learning to understand. She watched Ethan move through the house. She watched the ceiling fan turn. She watched the dust move through the light in the afternoon. The first day Ethan brought her water, she did not drink it. He brought her food. She did not touch it. He sat in the chair by the door and talked to her quietly about nothing. He talked about his job. He talked about the neighbor's dog that barked every morning. He talked about the weather. He just talked because silence felt wrong and because he had learned a long time ago that the sound of a calm voice could reach people even when nothing else could. On the second day, she drank the water. On the third day, something came through the window. It was small, about the size of a cantaloupe. It was dark and smooth, and it hovered without sound, and it had one single pale light on its front like an eye. It came in fast and stopped directly between Ethan and the bed, and the pale light turned red. Ethan did not run. He stood very still with his hands open at his sides and said calmly that he was not a threat. The little machine did not seem convinced. It made a very quiet sound like a warning. The woman in the bed spoke one short word in her language, and the machine's light went from red to yellow. It did not move. It did not leave. It just watched Ethan with that pale yellow eye like a guard dog that had been told to wait. Ethan looked at it and then looked at her and said he was going to name it something because calling it the machine felt rude. She stared at him. He said he would call it Rick. She said something in her language, and the translation device on the side table clicked and showed him the words. She said that its name was not Rick. He said that it was now. Something shifted in her face then. It was very small. It was barely a movement at all, but it was there. And it was the first time he had seen anything on her face that was not pain or fear or that deep, exhausted blankness. It was almost a reaction to something funny almost that was. The moment everything changed, he called his sister that afternoon. Mara was 27, sharp as a blade, and studying xenobiology at a university 3 states away, which at the time had felt like the most useless degree imaginable. Ethan had teased her about it more than once. Now he called her and told her he needed her to come and told her. There was a long silence on the phone then. Mara said she was already in her car. She arrived the next morning with 3 bags and a look on her face like someone who had waited their whole life for something and could not believe it was actually happening. She walked into the spare room and stopped in the doorway and just looked at the woman in the bed and said nothing for a full minute. Then she sat down on the floor, crossed her legs, and started asking questions through the translation device. The woman answered slowly at first, then more. The translation device was not perfect. It turned some things into strange, clumsy phrases, but it worked well enough. Mara worked with it for 2 days, adjusting, learning, filling in gaps with hand gestures and patience that Ethan did not know his sister had. By the end of the first week, they knew her name of just Vael, for now she gave them that much. They did not push for more. Ethan kept working his shifts. He would come home and find Mara and Vael sitting at the kitchen table with the translation device between them and notebooks. full of Mara's scrawled writing. Rix would hover in the corner, watching Ethan every time he walked in the light, shifting from yellow to something softer with each passing day. Ethan would make food and bring it to the table and sit down and listen. He noticed things about Vael that he could not quite explain. She held herself in a way that did not match someone who was recovering from injuries. She held herself in a way that made the room feel like it belonged to her, even though it was his room. She never asked for anything. She simply waited as if she expected things to arrive, and somehow he always brought exactly what she needed before she had to ask. He did not know if that was instinct or luck. On the 9th day, she spoke to him directly for the first time, not through the device. She looked at him across the kitchen table and said one word in his language, one word she had clearly been practicing, because it came out careful and deliberate, like something she had turned over in her mouth many times before she was willing to release it. She said, "Thank you." Ethan nodded and said she was welcome and asked if she wanted more soup. Rix's light turned completely white. Mara told him later that white meant calm. She said she had been reading the drone's color responses as a kind of emotional chart, and white was the closest thing it had to peace. Ethan said he had no idea hovering robots had feelings. Mara said everything that was built to protect something learned to feel. Eventually, the next morning, Mara came to find Ethan in the yard, where he was fixing a fence post, and her face was different. Something had happened. He could tell immediately. She said that Vael had talked to her for 2 hours the night before. Real talking. Not small, careful words, but long sentences about things that mattered, and that she had said one thing at the end that Mara could not stop thinking about. Ethan asked what it was. Mara said that Vael had told her she had been to 17 planets. She had met species that could move through solid rock, and species that communicated through light, and species that were older than Earth's sun. And in all that time, across all those worlds, she had never once been taken in by a stranger who asked for nothing in return. She said she did not have a word in her language for what Ethan was. Not a soldier, not a diplomat, not a healer by title, not someone acting on orders or politics or fear. She said the closest thing she could find in her language was a word that translated roughly a semyon, who helps because they cannot imagine doing otherwise. Ethan went quiet when Mara told him that he went back to fixing the fence post and did not say anything for a while. Then he said that it did not seem like that big a thing to him. Mara looked at him the way she used to look at him when they were kids, when he did something that she could not fully put into words. She said that was exactly the point. That night, Rix came and hovered next to Ethan while he sat on the porch watching the stars. It did not make any sound. It just stayed there beside him, its light a steady, quiet white, and Ethan sat with it and looked up at all that dark sky and thought about the fact that somewhere up there was a world that had no word for what he was, and that for some reason that felt like the loneliest and most important thing he had ever heard. The ships came on a Tuesday. Ethan was at work when Mara called him. Her voice was flat and controlled, the way voices get when the person speaking is terrified, but has decided that panic will not help. She said there were 3 ships in the sky above the farm. She said they were not small. She said Vael had seen them through the window and had gone completely still and told Mara one word through the device. Betrayed. Ethan left work without saying anything to anyone. He drove home fast. By the time he got there, Vael was standing in the kitchen, fully dressed in something that had come from her ship. Her injuries were not healed, not fully, but she was standing straight, and her gold eyes were clear and hard like 2 stones, and the softness that had slowly been building over 2 weeks was completely gone. She looked like a different person. She looked like someone who had worn kindness the way a person wears a coat and had now taken it off. Rix was red. Ethan asked what was happening. Vael looked at him and spoke, and the device translated in pieces. She said the ships above were not rescue ships. She said they belonged to a man named Sorvan. She said Sorvan sat on the ruling council of her empire, and that he had been the one who shot her down. She said she had been traveling without her full guard, trying to reach a meeting that could have stopped a war, and someone had told Sorvan exactly where she was. She said if those ships found her, she would not be taken prisoner. She said there was no word soft enough for what they would do to her. And looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Mara. Then he picked up his truck keys and said they needed to go. Mara asked where. Ethan said away from here, and they could figure out the rest. While moving, Vael said that Going anywhere on foot or by vehicle was meaningless. The ships above had sensors that could find her anywhere on the planet. Her only chance was to leave Earth entirely. She said there was a courier vessel docked at a small private port 200 kilometers north. She had arranged it before her mission as a backup. It was not her ship. It was not registered to her name. It was dirty and slow and full of people who moved things across the galaxy without asking questions about what those things were. Ethan said that sounded perfect. Vael stared at him. She said he did not understand. She said this was not his fight. She said the moment she left this planet it would become more dangerous than he could imagine. She said he should stay. She said he had already done more than anyone had any right to expect. Ethan said she had been shot down on his planet and that made it at least a little bit his business. Mara said she was coming. Tureks turned white. They drove north with the lights off for the first hour. The ships moved overhead twice but did not land. Vael navigated from the back seat using a device no bigger than a coin. She did not speak much. She watched the road. She watched the sky. She watched Ethan in the mirror with an expression he could not read. They reached the port before then. The ship was called the Ember Road, and it was the ugliest thing Ethan had ever seen. It looked like something that had been repaired so many times that the original ship was barely in there anymore. It was held together by parts from a dozen different things, and it smelled like engine fuel and something Ethan could not identify that burned the back of his throat. The crew was 4 aliens. None of them looked happy to see extra passengers. The captain was a short, broad creature with dark, layered skin and 4 arms and eyes that moved independently, and she looked at Ethan and Mara for a long time before she looked at Vael. Something passed across the captain's face, something like recognition, something like fear, but pushed down hard beneath manners. She said they could board. They left Earth as the sun was coming up. Ethan sat in a small cabin with a window that was scratched and dirty, and he watched his planet get smaller. He watched the blue curve of it. He watched the clouds moving slowly over the Pacific. He had never seen it from above before. He had never thought about what it would feel like, and it felt like something being taken away gently, like a hand leaving yours. Then it was gone. Mara came and sat next to him and did not say anything. Later, Vael came and stood in the doorway, and she told them the truth. Her full name was Vael'kira Solenne. She was not a soldier. She was not a diplomat in the common sense. She was the Empress-Designate of the Solenne sovereignty, a civilization that spanned 43 star systems and contained more living beings than Earth had. Grains of sand on all its beaches combined. She was supposed to take the throne in 6 months. She had been traveling in secret to stop Sorvan from starting a war that would kill millions, and Sorvan had stopped her first. Mara sat very still. Ethan asked if she had a plan. Vael said no. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said there was an old law in most governments on Earth that said if you could prove to a court that a leader was alive and had been wrong, the court had to hear the case. She asked if the sovereignty had anything like that. Vael looked at him slowly. She said there was something similar, an imperial provisional law so old most people had forgotten it existed. It said that any citizen who could present the Empress-Designate alive before the High Court of the Sovereignty could demand a full hearing that not even the council could block. Ethan asked how hard it would be to get there. Vael said nearly impossible. Ethan said that was not the same as impossible. Mara said she was starting to understand why the alien word for Ethan had no real translation. Vael looked at both of them for a long time. In the dim light of that ugly little ship, far from everything either of them had ever known, her silver skin caught the faint glow from the corridor behind her, and her gold eyes were very quiet. She said something in her language first before she switched the device on. The device translated it after a pause. It said, I have stood before emperors and generals and ancient councils, and not one of them ever looked at an impossible thing and said that is not the same as impossible. She said she did not know what to do with that. Ethan said she did not have to do anything with it. She just had to keep moving, so they did. The Imperial core was the most beautiful thing Ethan had ever seen, and he hated it immediately. Was a planet that had been built over so completely that no ground remained, only city, stacked on city, stacked on more city, rising in towers of glass and pale stone and metal that caught the light of its 3 suns and threw it back in colors that had no names in English. The sky was not empty. It was full of ships moving in lanes like blood through veins, and the sound from the surface even Filtered through the Ember Road's walls was a constant low hum like something enormous breathing. Vael'kira stood at the window and looked at it with no expression at all. Ethan stood beside her and said it was something she said she had not seen. It in 8 months it used to feel like home. She said used to like it was something she had already buried. They docked at a private bay arranged by one of Rix's secondary communications that even Sorvan's people had not found. They had 4 hours. Before the High Court session began, Sorvan had called the session himself, confident that he could use it to formally strip Vael'kira of her title on grounds of abandonment and instability. He had not expected her to walk through the doors. She walked through the doors. The High Court of the Solenne sovereignty was a room that could hold 10,000 people, and it was full. The walls were lined with screens carrying the session to every corner of the Empire. 43 star systems watching. Sorvan stood at the center, tall and cold and perfectly composed in the white formal dress of a council executor. His eyes found Vael'kira the moment she entered, and something moved through them fast, like a calculation running and finishing and arriving at a conclusion he did not like, but he recovered quickly. He always recovered quickly. He told the court that the Empress-Designate had been found hiding on a primitive, undeveloped world. A world not even registered for contact, a world where the dominant species still burned carbon for fuel. He said she had been sheltered by one of these primitive creatures for over 2 weeks. He said he was deeply saddened by her condition. He said with great false gentleness that a woman who had hidden in the dirt of a pre-contact planet, cared for by something that barely understood space travel, was not a woman fit to lead 43 systems. The court was quiet, not because they agreed entirely, but because Sorvan was frightening in the way that very controlled people are frightening, and because nobody wanted to be first. Then Mara stood up. She had no title, she had no standing. She had no right to speak in the High Court of the Solenne sovereignty, and every screen in 43 systems watched a young human woman from Earth stand up in the back of that hall and say loudly that she had something to say. The room stirred. Vael'kira looked at Mara. Mara looked at Ethan. Ethan stood up. He walked forward through that enormous room, and the crowd parted, not because they respected him, but because he moved like a man who had decided something, and that kind of movement makes people step back without knowing why. He reached the speaker's floor. He looked at Sorvan. He looked at the court. He looked at the thousands of faces on the screens. He was a paramedic from the American Midwest. He was wearing clothes he had bought at a gas station 2 planets ago. He had not slept more than 4 hours in 3 days. He spoke. He did not speak about politics. He did not speak about law. He did not speak about the sovereignty or the council or ancient provisions. He spoke about a field. He spoke about a dark road and a burning wreck and a woman lying in the dirt, afraid and bleeding and alone. He said he had found her and helped her not because of what she was, but because of who she was. A person in pain who needed someone to stop. He said he did not know anything about running an empire. He said he did not know anything about galactic politics. He said he was sure there were people in that room who knew 1,000 times more than him about how power worked and how decisions were made at this scale. Then he stopped and looked at Sorvan directly. He said he wanted to ask one question. He said, when Vael'kira was shot down and burning in the dirt of an unregistered planet with nobody to help her and nowhere to go, he wanted to know where all that power was. Then he said, where were the council members and the generals and the great minds of 43 systems when one person needed somebody to just stop? He said a farmer's road in the middle of nowhere on a planet nobody had bothered to contact was where she was found. He said he was the one who stopped. He said he was not a hero. He was not special. He was just a person who could not keep driving when someone was hurt. He said the question was not whether she was fit to lead. He said the question was whether a civilization that left its leader bleeding in a field deserved the leader it was getting back. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ethan had ever heard. It lasted a long time. Then it broke, not in applause, not in shouting. It broke in a sound like a tide shifting, the sound of thousands of people turning to each other, the sound of something moving under the surface of a very large thing. Sorvan's face did not change, but his hands did. They closed at his sides just slightly. The court senior, who had sat motionless through everything, leaned forward and said that the provision had been invoked and the session was now bound to full herring. Sorvan said the testimony of a primitive species was not admissible. Court Senior said that the provision made no specifications about species one of. Sorvan's counsel Elias stood and said that the Empress-Designate was clearly compromised by her time with undeveloped by Vael'kira spoke for the first time she said in a voice that filled the room without effort the way a person speaks when they have never had to raise their voice to be heard that she had sat before this court many times and had heard many arguments about strength and fitness and the qualities required to lead. She said she had spent 2 weeks on a planet that the sovereignty had not bothered to contact, and in that time she had learned more about those qualities than in all her years of preparation. She said the man standing on that floor had shown more genuine leadership in a cornfield on an unregistered world than Sorvan had shown in 20 years on the council. She said the hearing would proceed. Sorvan looked at Ethan one last time. Ethan looked back, and in that moment something passed between them that needed no translation at all. Sorvan did not go quietly. Nobody who had spent 20 years building something in the dark ever did. When the court ruled against him, when the evidence of his betrayal began to surface, piece by piece dragged into the light by the hearing that his own arrogance had made unavoidable, he did the thing that cornered men with armies always do. He called the soldiers that were loyal to him. The Imperial Corps shook, not like an earthquake, deeper than that, like something structural failing, like a building that had been rotting inside for years, finally deciding it was done, pretending the fighting lasted 9 hours. Ethan spent those 9 hours doing what he had always done. He moved through corridors that were filling with smoke and noise and fear, and he helped people. He did not carry a weapon. He did not know the layout of the Imperial Corps. He did not speak the language without the device in his pocket, but he knew shock when he saw it, and he knew how to slow bleeding, and he knew how to keep someone breathing. And in 9 hours he pulled 14 people out of places they would not have walked out of on their own. Nobody asked him to. He just could not stop moving past someone who needed help. It was simply who he was. Mara worked with Vael'kira's loyalists, using every piece of information she had absorbed in 3 weeks of obsessive learning. She could not fight, but she could think and she could talk. And she sat in a communications room for 6 straight hours threading messages between factions, helping people find each other, helping the people who wanted this to end find enough common ground to end. Tricks stayed with Ethan the entire time. Its light never left white. When Sorvan was finally found, he was not in some dramatic final position. He was in a lower corridor trying to reach a private ship. He was arrested quietly by 4 of Vael'kira's guards, and he said nothing. He looked at no one. He was simply taken away, and the thing that had been holding the chaos together collapsed, and the fighting stopped. The silence after was extraordinary. Then, slowly, the sound of the city came back, the hum, the movement, the breathing of something enormous returning to itself. Vael'kira was crowned 3 weeks later. Go to the ceremony. He stood in a corridor outside the hall with Mara and watched through a screen someone had propped against the wall. Mara cried. She did not apologize for it. Ethan handed her his jacket to wipe her eyes and watched the gold crown being placed, and felt something in his chest that was warm and heavy and did not have a clean name on the screen. Vael'kira was still and straight and perfect, and her gold eyes were open and calm, and then for just one moment she looked directly at the camera position near the corridor door, as if she knew exactly where he was standing. Ethan thought that was probably a coincidence. Her first act as Empress was to grant Earth the status of protected world. No mining, no colonization, no contact. Without consent, no one could touch it. No empire, no corporation, no fleet could approach without facing the full weight of 43 systems. Her second act was to open a quiet diplomatic channel, not a grand announcement, not a spectacle, just a channel, a door left open for whenever humanity felt ready. Her third act was sealed and not made public until later. It was a commendation. It had no military rank and no political weight. It was simply a formal record. It named Ethan Cole of Earth and described in precise language what he had done and what it had meant. And it was placed in the Imperial Archive in the section reserved for events that had changed the course of the sovereignty, not battles, not treaties, events. Ethan went home. He drove back to the farm on the same highway. He passed the cornfield. The earth had grown back in the spot where the ship had hit, tall green stalks moving in the summer wind. He pulled over and looked at it for a moment and then kept driving. He went back to work 14-hour shifts, the neighbor's dog barking in the morning, Car crashes and heart attacks and old people who grabbed his arm and begged him not to let go. He never let go. He did not tell anyone where he had been. He did not know how. He would begin a year past. He was sitting on the porch one evening in late summer watching the sun go down when a ship came across the sky. Not fast, not trailing fire, just quiet and smooth and deliberate, like something that knew exactly where it was going. It landed in the cornfield with barely a sound. He did not get up right away. He sat and finished his coffee. Then he walked out across the field. She was standing outside the ship alone. No guards, no ricks, no ceremony, just Vael'kira in simple clothes, with her white hair loose and her gold eyes catching the last of the evening light. She looked different from the woman who had been crowned. She looked like the woman who had drunk water on the second day, the woman who had said thank you. Like it was a word she had practiced. He said it had been a while. She said it had. He asked how the empire was going. She said it was complicated and exhausting and that she was working on. I said that sounded about right. They walked back to the porch and sat down and watched the stars come out. She told him that she had named a newly discovered star system after this road. The cartographers had wanted a grand name, something old and resonant. She had told them to call it Coal Road, and they had been very confused, and she had not explained it. Ethan looked at the sky and tried to imagine which stars were his stars and could not tell. She was quiet for a while, and then she asked him something. She asked if he ever thought about that night, if he ever thought about the moment when he saw the light in the field and considered keeping driving, what it would have meant if he had. He thought about it honestly. He said no. He said he never thought about it because it never felt like a real option. It did not feel like a choice. He made it felt like the absence of a different choice. Like the direction he moved was the only direction that made sense, and anything else would have required something he did not have. She looked at him. She said she knew that. She said that was why she came back, not to thank him, not to give him anything, not to bring him something grand. She came back because she had spent a year ruling 43 systems and making decisions that affected more lives than she could count, and every time she sat in that throne room and felt the weight of it, she thought about a man who pulled over on a dark road with no reason and no reward and no calculation at all. She said she came back because she needed to remember that it was possible to be that simple, that clean, that sure. Her voice was very quiet at the end, and it was not the voice of an empress. It was the voice of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had come to the only place where it felt lighter. Ethan did not say anything for a while. Then he said she could come back whenever she needed to. She looked at him, and for a moment her gold eyes were very bright, not with power, not with authority, just with something honest and old and true, the kind of thing that does not need a word in any language. They sat on the porch while the night came in and the stars filled up the sky, and somewhere up in that dark there were 43 systems turning and a civilization carrying the shape of something it had learned from a single quiet road on an unregistered world. In the Imperial Archive, the entry for Ethan Cole ends with one line. It was added by the Empress herself, and it was never changed. It reads, he stopped, he helped, everything else followed.